Michael Dawson, 38, had just landed at Los Angeles International Airport after a long flight from Dallas. His body was stiff from sitting for 5 hours, but he was glad to be back in California. He wasn't one to complain, though. His life was good. At 38, he was co-founder of a rapidly growing cybersecurity company, and though he wasn't expecting any recognition here, he liked the anonymity of just being another traveler in the bustling airport. He made his way toward baggage claim, checking his phone for any new emails. Lost in the usual chaos of the terminal, families running to catch their flights, kids crying, business travelers glued to their phones. The usual. But then something caught his eye. A man standing near the baggage claim entrance. The man, Officer William Hart, looked to be in his mid-40s, stocky and dressed in the standard TSA uniform. His eyes, however, were locked onto Michael in a way that felt too deliberate. Michael tried to shake it off, thinking he was imagining things, but the feeling persisted. Officer Hart wasn't just scanning the crowd like any other airport security officer. He was watching Michael closely. Michael glanced down at his phone again, trying to ignore it. Maybe he was just overthinking it. But when he looked up again, Officer Hart was still staring, his arms crossed, standing a little too still for someone who was just passing through. The feeling in Michael's gut deepened. He had been through this before, profiling that is, but usually it was subtle, a glance here and there. This, though, felt different. The officer was standing there, not moving, and Michael was starting to feel like the target. Michael tried to focus on the luggage carousel, but his eyes kept drifting back to the officer. Hart didn't seem to be watching anyone else. The couple next to him, arguing over their suitcases, didn't get a second glance. Neither did the teenager with headphones or the man pacing by the wall. Only Michael. The officer's unblinking stare was starting to make Michael uncomfortable. He sighed and looked back down at his phone, hoping this would pass. But it didn't. In a few moments, Hart took a step forward, heading straight for him. Michael's heart skipped. Here it was. He hadn't even done anything, but he knew what was coming. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Hart said, his voice abrupt and official. "Can I see some identification?" Michael blinked, thrown off by the directness. "Excuse me?" he asked. "I need to see your ID," Hart repeated, now closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. Michael glanced around. The other passengers were still milling about, none of them being stopped or questioned. He felt his pulse quicken, and instinctively his fingers tightened around the handle of his carry-on bag. "Why me?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension rising in his chest. Hart didn't answer, just stared at him. "You've been standing here for a while," he said, his tone clipped. Michael glanced around again, trying to keep his voice even. "So has everyone else. We're all waiting for bags." His stomach churned as he realized what was happening. "I need to see your ID," Hart insisted. Michael's mind raced. There were two options: comply and hand over his ID, letting the officer assert his control, or push back and face whatever consequences that might bring. He had been through this too many times to let it slide, but he also knew how quickly this could escalate. "Why are you only asking me?" Michael asked. "Everyone else is just standing here too." Hart's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. The tension hung in the air. Michael could feel it now. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, and he wasn't going to make it easy for Hart to brush this off. The silence stretched between them as Officer Hart's gaze intensified, his stance unwavering. Michael could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The officer was waiting, expecting him to submit, to just hand over his ID and make this easy. But Michael wasn't going to make it that simple. "Why me, officer?" Michael repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Why are you asking for my ID and not anyone else's?" Hart's expression hardened, but he didn't answer immediately. Michael could see the officer's frustration building, his jaw tightening as he glanced around, possibly aware of the increasing attention. More people were noticing now. Michael could feel their eyes on him, the hum of the busy airport fading slightly as the situation grew more intense. "This is going nowhere," Michael muttered under his breath. He wasn't going to be bullied into compliance, not this time. "I'm not showing you my ID unless you explain why you singled me out." For a brief moment, it seemed like Hart might snap, his fingers twitching near his belt. But then, just as the tension was about to reach its peak, a voice cut through the thick silence. "Excuse me, officer." The voice was clear, strong, and undeniably confident. Michael turned, recognizing the woman who had stepped into the scene. It was Jessica Green, an investigative reporter with a reputation for exposing injustice. Michael had seen her name on several prominent stories in the past. She stood just a few feet away, her phone raised, pointed at Officer Hart. Her presence was like a switch being flipped. Suddenly, the entire situation felt different. "I'm just making sure everything's handled fairly here," Jessica said, her tone calm but assertive. "You're not detaining him without cause, are you?" Hart froze for a moment, his body stiffening. His eyes flickered to Jessica's phone, and for the first time his confidence seemed to waver. He didn't expect to be recorded, and the realization hit him like a cold splash of water. Michael could see it, the shift in Hart's demeanor. The officer took a half step back, but the challenge in Michael's eyes wasn't going away. His body still tensed, ready for whatever would come next. But now the crowd around them had begun to take notice. Phones came out, capturing the scene, whispering among themselves. This wasn't just between Michael and Officer Hart anymore. It had become public. Jessica didn't lower her phone, keeping it steadily trained on Hart. "I just want to make sure everything's fair," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. Hart exhaled sharply, irritation creeping into his face. He shot Michael a look, one filled with frustration, but Michael stood his ground. He wasn't intimidated, not anymore. "You're really going to make this difficult?" Hart growled, his fingers twitching near his radio. He seemed torn between pressing the issue and backing off, but Michael wasn't backing down. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm waiting for my bag, just like everyone else. And you still haven't told me why I'm the one being singled out." The conversation seemed to hang in the air, the background noise of the terminal growing more distant as more eyes turned their attention to the unfolding drama. It wasn't just Michael and Officer Hart anymore. It was everyone in the terminal witnessing the power dynamics play out. People whispered, some even muttered in support of Michael. One of the passengers nearby spoke up, a woman with dark sunglasses. "Yeah, why is he the only one being questioned?" she asked. "I've been standing here the whole time, too." A younger man, his eyes wide in disbelief, nodded. "He hasn't done anything. I saw it all." Michael felt the tension shift. The officer who had been so confident in his authority just moments ago was now facing an audience, and he didn't like it. Hart's hand hovered near his belt again, but Michael stepped back slightly, raising his hands just enough to show he wasn't being aggressive, just making it clear that this wasn't going to go the way the officer wanted. Jessica's voice rang out again, sharper this time. "You might want to reconsider that, officer. There are at least 6 cameras on you right now." Hart's head snapped to her, and the officer's face reddened with both embarrassment and frustration. But he didn't have the authority he once did. Not with the cameras rolling, not with the crowd gathering. The tension in the air was palpable. Michael felt it. This moment had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was standing for something bigger, something that had been ignored too many times. And now the officer was beginning to realize it. Officer Hart's frustration was becoming palpable, his fists clenching at his sides, his eyes flickering between Michael and the crowd gathering around them. The hum of the airport faded, replaced by the intensity of the moment. Michael stood firm, his heart steady. He wasn't going to give in, not today. But as Hart's patience wore thin, the officer's fingers twitched toward his belt again, and Michael instinctively took another small step back. He didn't want this to escalate any further, but he wasn't about to be intimidated either. His hand, still holding the handle of his carry-on bag, was ready to defend himself if it came to that. Then, as if on cue, the situation shifted again. The sound of heavy footsteps approached from behind Officer Hart. Both Michael and Hart turned at the same time. A man in a gray blazer and airport security badge was heading toward them with purpose. Adrian Lee, the airport security director, walked with authority. Michael recognized him from previous visits to the airport, though they had never spoken. Adrian had a reputation for handling situations like this with professionalism, but Michael could tell he wasn't happy to see the standoff unfolding in front of him. Adrian's gaze moved from Michael to Officer Hart, then quickly scanned the crowd of onlookers. The tension was thick, and Michael could feel it in his chest. He had no idea how this would play out, but he knew things were about to change. "What's going on here?" Adrian asked, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Officer Hart seemed taken aback by the sudden intrusion, but quickly tried to maintain his composure. "This individual," Hart began, his voice tight, "was acting suspiciously near baggage claim. When I asked for identification, he refused to comply." Michael let out a slow breath, not surprised by Hart's explanation. He could already feel where this was going. "I wasn't acting suspiciously," Michael said, his voice even. "I've been standing here waiting for my bag. You singled me out for no reason. I didn't do anything wrong." Adrian turned his sharp gaze to Hart, and Michael could see the subtle shift in the officer's posture. He was no longer in control. "You asked for identification?" Adrian asked, his tone quiet but forceful. Hart nodded, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "And did you ask for his baggage claim receipt?" Adrian's question hung in the air, cutting through Hart's defense. Hart hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Michael's stomach churned. He had been right all along. Hart had jumped to conclusions and hadn't followed the basic protocol. "No," Hart muttered, his eyes darting away from Adrian's piercing gaze. Adrian turned back to Michael, his tone softening slightly. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "Can I see your baggage claim receipt?" Michael didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and quickly brought up the digital copy of his baggage receipt. It wasn't much, just a string of numbers on the screen, but it was all he needed to prove his innocence. He held it up, letting Adrian inspect it for a moment. Adrian glanced at it, then turned back to Hart, his expression hardening. "Did you ask for this, Officer Hart?" he asked, his voice low but unmistakably authoritative. Hart remained silent, unable to defend his actions. Adrian's frustration was evident, but he kept his composure. "You've made your point, officer," he said. "I suggest you take a step back and allow Mr. Dawson to continue." Hart's face reddened with both anger and humiliation. It was clear now that he had made a mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. Still, the growing crowd and the presence of Adrian, a higher-ranking authority, made it impossible for him to maintain the upper hand. Adrian turned back to Michael, his expression softer now. "You're free to collect your bag, sir," he said, giving a brief nod. Michael exhaled slowly, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like ages. The tension was lifting, but he didn't feel like celebrating just yet. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. But before Michael could take a step toward the carousel, he heard another voice behind him. "That's it?" It was Jessica, who had been quietly recording everything on her phone. She stepped closer, her gaze still fixed on Officer Hart. "You're just going to let him go? No apology? No accountability?" Michael could feel the weight of her words. He wasn't looking for an apology, but he wasn't going to let this slide without speaking up. Adrian seemed to understand, and he turned back to Hart, his voice firm. "Officer Hart, I'll be reviewing the footage from the security cameras. You'll be reporting to my office after your shift." Hart's face twisted, and for a moment, it looked like he might argue. But he didn't. Instead, he stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on the floor, clearly knowing his career had just taken a blow. Michael didn't gloat, but he couldn't deny the sense of justice that coursed through him. It wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't a situation that would go unnoticed. Michael took a deep breath, trying to let the tension of the past few minutes dissolve. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew it wasn't the immediate shift in power that had just happened. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but for the first time in a long while, the feeling wasn't one of being scrutinized. It was something else, something empowering. He hadn't let Officer Hart's actions slide, and he was aware of how significant that was. Adrian Lee, the security director, gave Michael a nod, signaling that he was free to go. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Dawson," he said. Michael nodded in return, his voice calm. "I appreciate your help," he said, though part of him felt like he hadn't gotten enough. It wasn't just about this situation. It was about a bigger issue, one he had seen too many times before. Before he could move toward the baggage carousel, a voice broke through the quiet. It was Jessica again, her phone still raised, recording the aftermath. "You've got everything you need, right?" she asked, her tone gentle but direct. Michael glanced at her. "I'm fine. I just want to collect my bag and go home." Jessica lowered her phone slightly, but she didn't stop recording. "You handled that really well," she said, her voice softening, "but you shouldn't have had to handle it at all." Michael didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned toward the carousel and started walking. He could feel the weight of her words, and they echoed in his mind. The truth was, this wasn't the first time he'd been unfairly targeted. It wouldn't be the last. And despite his calm demeanor, there was a growing frustration inside him that he couldn't shake. As he approached the carousel, he noticed a few other passengers still glancing his way, some with curiosity, others with a knowing look. They had seen what had happened. They had witnessed the abuse of power, the subtle prejudice, and now they were silently acknowledging it. Michael wasn't alone, but in that moment, he wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge. Adrian Lee followed behind him, a few paces back, but Michael wasn't sure what, if anything, could be done to resolve this beyond what had already happened. Officer Hart had been reprimanded, but that wasn't enough. It couldn't be. "Mr. Dawson," Adrian said, his voice quiet, "I'm sorry this happened to you. I'll be filing a report on the incident." Michael stopped and turned to face him, nodding slowly. "Thank," he said, his voice still calm, but now carrying a weight that wasn't there before. "But I'm not looking for an apology. I'm looking for change." Adrian hesitated, as though unsure of how to respond. "I understand," he said finally. "We all do, but sometimes it takes time." Michael shook his head. "It's been happening for years. People like me are tired of waiting for time to fix things." He paused, glancing over at the crowd around them. "What happened here today? It's not about me. It's about everyone who has ever been in this position and never had the chance to fight back." Adrian didn't say anything. He just nodded, knowing that Michael was right, even if the reality was hard to accept. Finally, Michael's bag appeared on the carousel. He reached forward, grabbing it with a quick motion. He could feel the weight of the situation settling over him again. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Michael turned toward the exit, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from his business partner, Adam. "Is everything okay? This is blowing up on social media." Michael froze for a moment, the weight of the words settling in. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't thought about the consequences beyond this moment. But the video of the confrontation was already spreading. He had known it was being recorded, but the realization that it was now being shared, scrutinized and discussed by thousands of people hit him harder than he expected. Jessica stepped closer, her phone still raised. "I knew it would go viral," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "You're already making waves. People are listening now." Michael let out a slow exhale, his hand gripping his phone tighter. "I didn't want this. I just wanted to get home." Jessica's eyes softened. "Sometimes the fight finds you, whether you're ready for it or not." Michael nodded, unable to respond. He could feel the weight of her words settling in. The fight was never just about the confrontation itself. It was about the larger fight for justice that had been ongoing for far too long. And now, for better or worse, he was a part of it. By the time Michael left the baggage claim area, he was already aware that the video had gone viral. It didn't take long for the footage to surface on social media, and within minutes, it was everywhere. Michael hadn't planned for any of this. He had just wanted to get home, to put this frustrating encounter behind him. But now the world was watching. As he made his way through the airport doors, he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His phone vibrated in his hand, and he glanced down at the screen. A text from Adam, his business partner, flashed across the display. "This is blowing up, man. You good?" Michael's stomach tightened as he read the message. He wasn't sure what he felt. Relief, anger, confusion. He hadn't signed up for this, but now it was bigger than him. The story was out there, and it was taking on a life of its own. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, a journalist from a major news outlet. "Mr. Dawson, we're reaching out for a statement on what happened at LAX. Can you confirm the details?" Michael rubbed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much bigger, the systemic issues that had been ignored for too long, and now the world was starting to pay attention. Jessica was still by his side, her phone in hand, her eyes glued to the screen. "The video's at 50,000 views already," she said, her voice almost detached. "Give it a few hours and it'll be in the six figures." Michael couldn't believe it. The comments were already rolling in. "This is why we need accountability in law enforcement." How many times has this happened before without anyone speaking up? Props to this guy for keeping his cool. The praise for his calm under pressure was overwhelming, but it only made him feel more isolated. He hadn't done anything special. He had just stood up for himself, something too many people didn't get the chance to do. By midday, news stations were running segments on the incident. The police department issued a statement calling the situation deeply concerning, promising a full internal review. But Michael knew better. He had seen this before. Words without action, empty promises that meant little in the grand scheme of things. Meanwhile, Officer Hart's past was beginning to unravel. Within hours, someone dug up 2 prior complaints of excessive force that had been swept under the rug. Now they were back in the spotlight, and people were demanding answers. Michael's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some wanted interviews, others were talking about lawsuits. Civil rights organizations were drafting statements, and the media was digging into Hart's history. But Michael wasn't focused on any of that. He was more concerned about the bigger picture. Officer Hart was likely to face some kind of disciplinary action, but Michael knew that wasn't enough. The system was designed to protect its own, and it would fight to do just that. Even if Hart was punished, he'd likely pop up somewhere else, in another town, with another badge, ready to repeat the cycle. Sitting in the airport cafe, Jessica looked at him intently, her phone now set down. "How are you holding up?" Michael didn't know how to answer that. His fingers hovered over his phone, looking at the flood of messages from people who had shared their own stories of discrimination. Some were thankful, others were angry. Many were scared. "This changes everything," he said quietly, the weight of it settling on him. "But now I have to decide what to do next." Jessica raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" Michael looked up from his phone, meeting her gaze. "The power isn't just in the video, it's in the choice." The choice. It was in his hands now, and Michael knew that the real fight was just beginning. He had already been thrust into the middle of it, but he wasn't going to let it slip away. As he sat in his car, the city of Los Angeles stretching before him, he scrolled through the flood of messages in his inbox. Some from old friends, some from strangers. People thanking him, sharing their own stories. "Thank you for standing your ground. This happens to me too, but I didn't have the courage to fight back." Michael could feel their pain, their frustration. They were all part of this, all fighting the same fight. He knew that he had options. He could give interviews, he could take legal action, or he could keep his head down and let the world move on. But none of those options felt like the right choice. The thing was, he didn't want this fight to end just because the video had gone viral. He didn't want to be a moment. He wanted to be a catalyst. Michael tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. And then, without hesitation, he opened a new post on social media, his thoughts flowing through his fingers. "I wasn't looking for a fight today. I was just trying to get home." But that's the thing about moments like this. They remind you that staying silent won't stop it from happening again. This wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, if we keep the cameras rolling, keep the pressure on, and keep demanding change, one day it will be different. He hit post. And just like that, the story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been in this position, everyone who had ever been silenced. Because awareness wasn't enough anymore. It was time for accountability.